I think many of you know me. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate School. I'm pleased to welcome you all here tonight to our conversation. Rather than going through the normal spiel about the Gotham Center and tonight's speaker and his bio, I think we should just jump straight into the conversation. So, Chris, if you'll join me. I'm very pleased to welcome Christopher Minty, who is an editor at the Center of Digital Editing at the University of Virginia and is the author of this new book that we're talking about tonight, Unfriendly to Liberty, the Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City. So Chris, you and I have known each other for many years, and you've contributed to several projects at the Gotham Center, including the new New York City Revolutionary Trail project that we're developing for the upcoming anniversary. And I've been looking forward to doing this and having this conversation for a long time. So I'm very glad that you can join me. I'm very excited about the book. Congratulations. It was fantastic. I learned a lot. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you tonight about it.
No, thank you. Thank you, Peter. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll be sure to close right on time so that we don't interrupt your evenings. And Peter and I will have a good conversation about the book. It's great to be engaging with the Gotham Center again. As Peter mentioned, I've contributed to a few projects there, and it's always a pleasure to work with Peter and his staff. And the Gotham Center does such important work. And I feel that my book is on New York City, and there might not be a more natural place to talk about it than the Gotham Center.
Well, I appreciate that. And I agree thoroughly. So I think maybe the way to start off the conversation most sort of logically is to sort of, and this may sound a little sort of odd to folks, but I think the best way to start off is kind of to say, like, well, how does this fit into the scholarly literature? Obviously, like some folks in the audience may not be sort of familiar with the literature, but, you know, a book about loyalists in New York City, both those things are sort of unfamiliar topics in the way that are sort of unfamiliar to folks who are buffs of the American Revolution. So I think maybe the way to sort of start that conversation is to say, well, what do the experts know about the Loyalists, and how does this book contribute and fit into that wider debate and ongoing research?
Mm-hmm. So I think the best way to answer this is to talk a little bit about how I researched and wrote this book, this project. And when I first started working on it, I started at the end. And what I mean by that is that I wanted to identify as many loyalists in and around New York City, New York State, or the colony of New York, if I could, and sort of determine their paths to loyalism. So my first step was to find loyalists in New York. So I went through newspapers looking for loyalist petitions or declarations that were published. And then I was able to find several that were published in Hugh Gaines' New York Gazette, James Rivington's newspaper as well. And I constructed a database where I just listed their names. So I just plugged all their names in, created an entry for these people, and this database was going to store information about them. And I kept looking for more lists, more people, and I was able to find some manuscript declarations where these declarations were left in taverns in Manhattan, and people came in to sign these documents, to put their name to them. Once the British Army retook New York in 1776 and assumed control, they sometimes forced, or many people took the oath of allegiance. So that the numbers of people that I had was going up and up and up. And I started to go backward to try and determine their paths to loyalism. And what I was finding is the same people were linked together in various ways, not just in these documents. And I thought that was quite interesting. And then I was going back, looking at more sources, and these same people were connected. So I thought, right, let's go all the way back to 1760s, go back before if I can. And I found out that loyalists, people who become loyalists in 1765 were members of the Sons of Liberty. And they weren't loyalists then, they were just colonists then, but they were members of the Sons of Liberty. And I thought, this kind of goes against the grain, because most historians from sort of the revolutionary era, when they started writing histories almost immediately after, up until now, have used the Stamp Act as like a neat starting point for colonists' path toward revolution. So when you have historians like Marcy Otis Warren and David Ramsay, they're writing sort of almost immediately after the American Revolution, they're writing with a goal in mind to help create national identity, create a shared history. So the Stamp Act is a natural starting point for them. And historians throughout the 19th century and in the 20th century and the 21st have sort of adhered to this narrative that the revolution kind of begins in 1765, and then for the people who were Sons of Liberty, it's almost inevitable that they become patriots or revolutionaries. And what's often overlooked is that people who became loyalists were not only in the Sons of Liberty, but they were leaders in the Sons of Liberty. And nowhere was that more true than in New York City. So you have people like James Delancey, who features on the cover of the book, and someone like Joseph Alacoque, who were leaders of the Sons of Liberty. They both became loyalists in the revolution. How did I know they became loyalists? James Delancey, he leaves. He is a more obvious sort of loyalist. But Joseph Alacoque signs his names to loyalist declarations and petitions. That identifies him as a loyalist. And he has to flee. He goes to Antigua in 1777 because he's concerned for his personal safety. Because he thinks that his status as a loyalist, people might attack him, like physically attack him, because that happened to many people on both sides. It wasn't just revolutionaries or patriots attacking. And I thought, I wonder if there are more examples. Like, how did they participate beyond the Stamp Act? And by exploring the people who became loyalists who were associated with the Delanceys, I found that they sort of organized coherent opposition to Parliament's attempted reorientation of the British Empire from the Stamp Act all the way up until 1774 to 1775. They didn't support Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, or the Coercive Acts. They were against those. They wanted autonomy. James Delancey in 1765 proposes an American Parliament and suggests to the Marquis of Rockingham that the Parliament in Britain only has control over things like trade, and that will help spur the growth of New York City and the growth of New York. That these loyalists or these would-be loyalists' participation in the Imperial Crisis in the same way as those who became patriots was something that I hadn't seen in the literature. I still don't see it too much in the literature, and I wanted to explore that. And in doing so, like, this is a book about people who became loyalists, but in doing so, in exploring the would-be loyalist path or paths to revolution, the book is also a history about the origins of the revolution, because it explores the lives and stories of those who became patriots or revolutionaries almost just as much as those who became loyalists. You have people like Alexander McDougall emerging on the scene. He does get some credit in the literature, but not as much as I think he's due, because he is really sort of the leader of the revolutionary movement in New York City and sort of the leader of opposition to the Delanceys. And the book is almost as much about him as it is about James Delancey. But that narrative that people kind of use the Stamp Act as the natural starting point is one that I identified early, and I just wanted to explore it further. And what are the implications of this? Like, people who became loyalists participated in the opposition to Parliament. That goes against what the early historians said. It goes against traditional stereotypes of who the loyalists were and what they did prior to the revolution. Most people, when they think of loyalists, they still think of people in Massachusetts like Thomas Hutchinson, who's a very high figure in Massachusetts politics, Massachusetts government, very prominent loyalist. They think of people like Cadwallader Colden, who's probably the most hated colonial official in New York, if not all of the colonies. or they think of someone like Joseph Galloway, and that these people are all prominent. They all write quite vehemently against what's happening, like the rise of revolutionary governments, revolutionary committees. And in New York, that does happen, and many of these people become loyalists. But by exploring the origins more fully, you can understand why these people became loyalists. And it wasn't because they supported Parliament from 1765.
Well, yes, before we get into that, I mean, there's a couple of things you said here that I want to sort of unpack a little bit, right? If I can kind of sort of so I'll steal from your introduction, actually, and sort of distill some of what you were saying before about where this sort of fits in the literature. You have this sort of lovely line where you talk about sort of all the different sort of waves of interpretation we've had about the revolution over the years, right? As you say, since the guns stopped firing, even during the war, really, people start writing the history of the revolution, right? And we know the old sort of chestnut about history is written by the winners and things like that. But despite all the sort of twists and turns that the literature has taken, even some folk from people who have a quite sort of critical view of like the motives of the patriots and the sort of the meaning of the revolution, things like that, right? We've sort of been stuck with this narrative that there are these two groups, right? The patriots, and the sort of impression is that there's the overwhelming majority of the country, right? And then a small bunch of very rich people who are in bed with the crown, and those are the loyalists, and they're there almost from the start. And they are, I mean, as the word Tory means at the time, right? They are royalists, and they are defending, sort of almost feudal way of life, and they are opposed to the whole ideology of republicanism at the time. And that's not right, right? So you referenced the appendix to your book where you go through this big data search that you made of all these people who become loyalists in New York, and I want to sort of just table set for a second your point about how we shouldn't be necessarily using these categories for the period leading up to the war, which we know is the Imperial Crisis. One of the things that comes out of that data set, which I thought was so wonderful, is that the loyalists are not the kind of people that we imagine at all, right?
Mm-hmm. And there have been other studies of who the loyalists were, and that's generally how loyalist studies has moved forward, is that people study them when they were loyalists. And that's how you get the category of like the loyalist. I studied the loyalists. And usually it's after 1775 or 1776, and they study what happened during the revolution. There's more work that's being done on what happened to loyalists after the revolution, but there are very few studies that examine what happened to them before. Like, how did they become loyalists? And so people have done these comparative analyses of who they were and shown that they were a diverse group of people, just as the people who were patriots were. But they haven't explored like these diverse groups' paths toward 1774 or 1775. And that's what I've set out to do in this book. And the reason why people haven't studied that partly is because of sources. And I encountered this when I was doing this work, is that when you study a place like Manhattan, many of the traditional sources that historians use are not available to you. Like when you're thinking about correspondence, people writing letters to each other, people in Manhattan didn't do that because they saw each other and they just spoke to each other on the street. So I had to look for other ways to try and connect these people together and track their journeys toward revolution. And similar to that, or related to that, is that during the rise of sort of modern documentary editing as we know it, and by that I mean like the papers of Thomas Jefferson, the Adams papers, the papers of George Washington, which is a project that I work on now, they were founded sort of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and you have this massive, rich sources of material that go right into the Revolutionary War. They tell you a lot about not just the people that these projects are based on, but the people in their universes. There aren't similar projects focused on those who became loyalists. And if you think about sort of the British side of things, like the British generals like Sir Henry Clinton, even someone like Thomas Gage, there are very few sources available for them as well. Now, the Clements Library at the University of Michigan is digitizing Thomas Gage's papers, which is great. And there's a 2-volume edition that was published in the 1930s, which was also great. But in comparison to the people who were patriots, the number of sources available for loyalists is much fewer. And
Yeah,
especially when you work in urban centers, it's hard to tie them together.
well, you and I know this from personal experience, because one of the things we've worked on over the past few years is to try to get a documentary series of the papers of Robert Livingston Jr., one of the co-signers of the Declaration of Independence and drafters of the Declaration of Independence, among many other sort of lead accolades from the sort of heroics of the patriot side of the American Revolution. And that has proved difficult as filling out, the papers of Washington and Adams and all the other sort of giants has proved extraordinarily difficult. But it is far more difficult to get papers of the Loyalists and those things together. So the source material is a huge problem, right?
Yeah, and there are some sort of caches of sources available, and you have to be creative in how you use them. Many people who study loyalists have used Loyalist Claims Commission. So after the war, people who left what was then the United States submitted compensation claims to the British government to sort of recoup some of their losses. Now, these sources are great because they often detail essentially the extent of their loyalism. They try to show how much of a big loyalist they were, and they detail their losses, like what they left behind and how their loyalism cost them. These sources are great, but they're often exaggerated because these people are trying to recoup as much as they can. So they say they might have embellished what they lost. And also it only really focuses on a narrow population, those who left. And for the people who stayed, the people who I study who appear in the book, the majority of the people, they stayed. And so they have papers. The New York Historical Society, the Rhinelander family papers are there. There isn't that much correspondence in there. There's a little bit in ledgers. So Frederick Rhinelander writes to people he deals with in Britain, and he's writing about the Imperial Crisis and how he is against the reorientation of the British Empire. But he is also against the rise of committees, congresses, and people like Alexander McDougall. And that's in a ledger. It's not a traditional place where you would expect to find it. And other things that I use to try and track these people throughout the 1760s and 70s, which goes back to how I started the project, in that I'm trying to link these people together. And I was very fortunate to work with a number of wonderful archivists and librarians at the New York Historical Society and at the New York State Archives. And I explained to them that I'm trying to find out as much about these people as possible, and I'm trying to link them together. Do you have any ideas? So people at the New York Historical Society, ledgers are one, receipts are another, anything that you can kind of track people's movements. So I was able to do network analysis of 3 loyalists and showed how their relationships developed and strengthened over time as the Imperial Crisis developed. And not only did they interact in a commercial sense more, but they also intermarried. They started to purchase land in upstate New York. They used to buy sort of commercial vessels as well. When loyalists died, their probate records have executors and witnesses, and they would often act in those capacities with each other. So essentially, when their friend died, they would act as a witness or an executor to help see their estate through probate. And that's how the overall idea about this project came together, is that I kept on seeing the same names together in single documents like probate records or land documents or in these ledgers. Is that I was like, these people who would go on to sign loyalist declarations and petitions, they were interacting years before. they were going to tavern events in 1770 to celebrate commemorate the repeal of the Stamp Act. They're also in a political club together where they surely talk about politics. And these families are also intermarrying. And what's more, some of them are writing about each other in letters to other people. And I was just like, this is really odd. So that's how this whole sort of genesis about the Delancey Association formed and developed. It was really, the sources were dictating how I was moving forward. It wasn't the other way around. And that's how I think history should be written. And it was quite thrilling at times when I was sat in the New York State Archives in Albany, seeing the same names again and again and again. I was like, there has to be something there. So I'd go further back and trying to work out when these relationships really started to develop. And for me, and I explain this in the book, because the book doesn't start with the Stamp Act crisis. I mention it, but the book starts with the 1768 election in New York, because everybody in New York, except for maybe Colden, was against the Stamp Act. But in 1768, you have an association centered around James Delancey forming around their political views. And they weren't Tories, they were all Whigs. They wanted to set up a Republican government in New York. In the New York Assembly Journal, James Delancey gives a speech saying that they want to erect a republic in the colony of New York. And the Delanceys get elected in 1768 by broadening their support through using innovative and methods to mobilize voters. So they write newspaper articles, they publish them in the press, they use
well, before we get into that, and I want to get into that, I think that's where we go after this. I just want to sort of like underscore, I mean, this is kind of the heart of the argument, right? I mean, so we've been talking about how, the Loyalists just have not been part of the narrative, right? And it's not just for the public, right? But for scholars are sort of, and this is often sort of interpretation driven as well as the source problem. There's a sort of assumption embedded in the historical understanding that these folks were of a certain sort of class and of a certain ideology. And your point really is that in New York, which is the headquarters of loyalism, right? We find all these people who, don't fit this sort of demographic profile. And that's one of the lovely things about the big study that you include as the appendix to your book, in which young farmers, right, are the largest demographic group that you find, not sort of very wealthy men like James Delancey, who is very wealthy and arguably one of the maybe the wealthiest guy in North America, right? But two, also that these folks, as you say, it is jarring for the person who's sort of normally who's familiar with this literature, right, about the coming of the American Revolution, what we call the Imperial Crisis, to not start with the Stamp Act. But this is to your point, right, that we read history backwards in this period, and we use these terms loyalist and patriot when those positions are not there in the beginning, and in fact reversed in New York, right, where the people who become the future loyalists are actually allied with the Sons of Liberty, the leading sort of rebel group in North America, right through into the early 1770s. And that, the second part of your argument, that they have this distinct vision themselves for how New York and the wider 13 colonies, how they should respond to the crisis, and the vision that they have for the colony as a whole, which is not diametrically opposed to what the rebels are talking about in some ways. But one of the, okay, so we'll get to that. But why don't we come back to one of the things that's also, I think, really sort of original about your work and is dead on, is that this is New York City, right? 1760s, 1770s. It's a very small town, right? You say 22,000 people, some folks argue it's slightly larger than that. I'm not going to take a position. But it's a very small town. It's a town where, you can walk across Manhattan, right? Which is New York City proper, although the outer boroughs, what we now know as the outer boroughs, are part of this kind of metropolitan world. You can walk across Manhattan like what, in 2 hours? So people are, it's not surprising that you discover all these sort of networks because people are living cheek by jowl. You have 22,000 people crammed into this very small area. And these people are meeting each other on the street all the time. You would see, it wouldn't be uncommon, right, to see the Lieutenant Governor Cadwalader Calden or Robert Livingston Sr. or any of these sorts of characters. There's sort of economic segregation and other sorts of, we find these sort of clusterings. But anyway, this is going off into other territory. But one of the things I think that is really sort of interesting about this book is, you go into why the Loyalists are so successful too. And they are, if I can sort of put it this way, they're doing a lot of the things we would have sort of expected the rebels to be doing. They're doing democratic politicking, right?
Yeah, and I think to go back to your point about New York City, I think like having a sense of place is critical here. And when people have traditionally studied Loyalists, they haven't looked at New York City really before the revolution. They've looked at other places like Massachusetts, and the prominent Loyalists there are all kind of, some of them are stereotypical. As I said, Thomas Hutchinson, he's like the archetype of the stereotypical Loyalist. Everybody hates him, he hates them back, and then off he goes. He doesn't come back. And I think that has sort of the focus on other areas like Massachusetts, Boston, and on Philadelphia at the expense of New York has hindered our interpretation of the revolution. And I can say this without any reservations. I think that New York City is the most important urban center prior to the revolution. And I think that what happened there during the Imperial Crisis had a more significant impact on the coming and the course of the revolution. And in 1774, it's Alexander McDougall and Isaac Sears who write to Samuel Adams in Boston to suggest a Continental Congress. And McDougall, he is a really underappreciated figure here. The way that he politics behind the scenes is really significant for the people who go on to become revolutionaries and patriots. For the people who go on to become loyalists, the way that the Delanceys sort of reimagine popular politics in New York City really alters our understanding of the origins of American political practice. Because I started talking about the 1768 election, the first thing that they do is they announce the Delancey candidates. There's 3 of them. They announce their candidacies in the newspaper. So they run these.
We're talking about the Delanceytes, just to sort of remind our audience that they don't know. The Delanceytes are essentially the faction in New York City that become the Loyalists.
Yeah.
And folks like Isaac Sears and Walter McDougall represent the Sons of Liberty, the leading rebel group, and they are allied with the Delanceytes at first. So continue.
Yeah. So they announced their candidacies in the press separately because they don't want to be seen as a party, because at that time party, and afterward, party is bad. People might still say party is bad now, but they announced them separately, and they said, I'm running for election to the New York Assembly. I don't want to do this, but I've been encouraged to do it by the people. So they're sacrificing their own sort of goals here to do what's best for the people of New York City. And that becomes a theme in what the Delanceys do in the 1760s and early 1770s, is that they argue that they are best suited to represent and advance New Yorkers' needs and interests. So they announce their candidacies in the press. They start publishing essays in the press. These essays are also published as broadsides, sometimes simultaneously, so they'll be published in the newspaper. but they'll also be published as a separate sheet, so you can just take it out. They also publish these little playing cards, and the playing cards are probably like no bigger than this, sort of just like a index card, probably a bit smaller, like the size you get in a normal pack of cards. And they would have their arguments on why they are suited, better suited than their opponents. And in 1768, their opponents were primarily members from the Livingston faction. People here probably know the Livingston faction, people like William Livingston, Philip Livingston, someone like John Moran Scott. These people go on to become prominent patriots, and most histories of New York prior to the Revolution have focused on the Delanceys on one side and the Livingstons on the other. The Livingstons are there in my book, obviously, but I put McDougall as more of a central role. And the Delanceys in 1768, they criticized their opponents and they slander them as lawyers. Like some members on the Livingston tickets were lawyers. And they said that, well, New York City is a commercial city.
So this is where the hatred of lawyers comes from. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is where it starts. They say in these.
You heard it here first. Yes.
In the
My apologies to all the lawyers out there. This is just
the playing cards. They say no lawyers in the assembly. And why no lawyers in the assembly? Well, the Delanceys argue that lawyers are just trying to put their hand in your pocket to take money from you. Whereas they're merchants. The Delanceys are all merchants. So they're trying to put money into your pocket and throughout the city. So as a commercial city, merchants best understand New Yorkers' needs and interests. So they should be elected. And in 1768, it works. And not only do they sort of utilize the city's print culture, they start to form bonds with people on like a one-on-one level. So in the run-up to the election, the way that elections happened in colonial New York City was it was open air. People could vote for multiple candidates over a series of days. So in the run-up to the election, the Delanceys had events in the city's taverns. Now, there was probably more taverns in New York City than anywhere else, and it's probably the same now.
One for every 13 people.
Yeah, there were a lot of taverns in New York, and the Delanceys had events in sort of one tavern that was run by a tavern keeper called Benjamin Stout, and they had events for 5 days. And these events were fueled by alcohol. There was a lot of food. There was, well, I'll say it again, a lot of alcohol, and the Delanceys paid for everything. So they had these were political events where people would talk politics, they would talk shop, they would talk about anything, and they formed relationships with one another. And these relationships
are the key. Well, kind of to your point about, I don't know if you would go this far, but kind of to your point about, we can see the beginnings of political practices that continue in New York and elsewhere in this story, right? Like taverns are the places, these are the public spaces, right? This is where you go to sort of talk about politics and to socialize, talk about, whatever. But they're incredibly important political sites at this time, as they would remain. I mean, so in the days of Tammany Hall in the 1800s, right? It's the saloons, right, where politicking is happening.
So it's happening in the taverns. People will spill out of the taverns and be like, oh, that was great. They'll tell their friends. There's another event the next night. They go to that. And these events kind of mobilize and create and then reinforce these associational ties with people. And these ties are reinforced the next year in 1769 because there's another election. The Delanceys use the same tactics. They publish their candidacies in the press. They publish things in the newspaper. They print broadsides. They have tavern events. Their opponents, which are the Livingstons again, they try to use some of the same tactics here. They publish things in the press, and they really attack the Delanceys. And the Delanceys, it was really smart politicking here. They take the Livingstons' arguments about how they're selfish, they're only out for themselves, and they flip it on the head. They flip the Livingstons' argument on its head and say that they're trying to divide New Yorkers. They're trying to divide us. We want to bring everybody together to move the city forward. And the Livingstons fall completely flat on their face. And someone like Philip Livingston, he was originally, he had been the Speaker of the Assembly. He had a lot of public experience. The Delanceys wanted him to be on their ticket. And he was like, I don't want to be on your ticket. I don't want to stand for election. I don't want to have anything to do with this. but then he appears on the Livingston ticket and people attack him because they call him a snake in the grass, like he's playing a double game here. And that hurts his credibility, and the people who are listed with him hurts their credibility as well. And
well, yeah, I'm going to interject and just say that I think that you're very persuasive on that point, and I agree. However, I think you're maybe underserving your point here in that, as you were saying before, the act of bringing people into these places, paying for all that food and drink, right, and engaging them for their vote, right, is, as you make repetitively and abundantly clear in the book, and rightly so, is something of a novum, right? The Livingstons, who go on to become the leaders of the rebellion at the time of the revolution in New York City, they're not doing any of that, right?
well, they're relying on traditional modes of politicking, which is at that time is deference, really. Like, you voted for us for a long time, and you should continue to do so. And it really doesn't work. And like I played soccer for a long time. I've had events where people, like, the club will pay for things. Is great. People enjoy it. It still happens today. And people are encouraged to go back. And you develop these ties with the people that you're with. You know, like, I had a good time. I had a good time too. We're talking about politics. We share the same ideas. I've seen this person in their shop or walking down the street many, many times. And you develop these bonds. It starts in 1768. It may have already started in 1765, but 3 years later, come the elections, you're like, these people have similar views to me on how things are going with Parliament and what they're trying to do. And I really support what the Delanceys are trying to do in New York. And the Livingstons really failed to grasp this, the way that the Delanceys are trying to mobilize support. And it's not until someone like Alexander McDougall comes on the scene, and he uses pretty much the same tactics as the Delanceys do. He publishes many essays in the press. Him and his colleagues, his compatriots, they end up having a sort of a private venue for themselves to have these types of events that the Delanceys are putting on, called Hampden Hall. So they have their events there in that sort of tavern space. And then the Delanceys have their events in their own tavern space. And by the sort of the end of the decade, the end of the 1760s into the early 1770s, you have this sort of peculiar moment in Manhattan where you have two groups who are calling themselves the true sons of liberty, and their opponents are not. And this is, at that point, this is, for me, this is when it happens in New York, is come around 1770, March-ish 1770. That's where the real divide happens, is that you have, go ahead.
Well, two things. Just because I'm watching the clock here, and we got a late start. Finish your point if you want to make it. But what happens? Why does it go off the rails? If these folks are, I mean, I agree with you. It's this sort of, this is not the way we're sort of supposed to understand the revolution, right? And I think it's why, like New York, I fully agree. This is the argument we make in our Revolutionary Trail project. It turns up on its head the way we think about the Revolution Convention, the old narrative. And New York really is the center of action across this whole period. So what goes wrong for the Loyalists, quote unquote, right? And I agree we should kind of retire that term. I don't know if that's really possible at this point, but it's a very problematic term. And two, if they're when you sort of answer the question about sort of what goes wrong for them and how these sort of alignments sort of realign, and we end up with the Loyalists and the Patriots. What is it that the Loyalists sort of are envisioning? If in the early period of the Imperial Crisis, they're content to rebel against the Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts, all the major sort of pieces of legislation that are cramping down on the colonial economy, nowhere stronger maybe than in New York, and making life miserable for people, creating this terrible period of depression and the rest.
So McDougall's emergence sort of starts the divisions forming. And MacDougall emerges in late 1769. And prior to that, the Delanceys had organized the construction of a viewing chamber in the New York Assembly. It's exactly as it sounds. People could come in and watch their elected officials advancing and protecting their interests. And MacDougall was someone who used to come every day and just watch. He says he used to come every day. He might not have come every day, but he said he did. And in December 1769, the Assembly's debating the quartering of British troops in New York City. It was a contentious issue. Don't have too much time to get into it tonight, but it was a very contentious issue. People did not want that to happen. But New York City was also in an economic downturn, and they needed paper money issued into the city, into the colony. And so what the Delanceys did, two of them had a sort of a meeting with Isaac Sears. Isaac Sears goes on to become a very prominent revolutionary and patriot. By this time, up until this time, he is firmly associated with the Delanceys. Firmly. He helped campaign for them. He helped get them elected. He supported them. They have a meeting with him about
the most radical figure in the Sons of Liberty.
Yeah. They had a meeting with him. How do we deal with this issue? And Sears spoke with John Kruger, Delancey politician, James Johnsey, another one. And he recommended that they could get the issue with quartering troops over the line if money was injected into the economy. So you tie them both together. And that's what the Delanceys did. However, what they also did was lock the assembly doors so people couldn't get in. And MacDougall, very fast, very quickly, writes a broadside called To the Betrayed Inhabitants of New York. And he says that the Delanceys have essentially shown who they really are. They're self-interested, they're selfish. They've formed an alliance with Cadwallader Colden, who's the temporary governor at this time, and they're only out for themselves. And by associating
the Stamp Act, yes.
By associating them with Colden, people start to sort of squint their head a little bit and go, what's happening? And MacDougall keeps it up. And he writes the broadside anonymously. He is eventually arrested and imprisoned. And when he's in prison, people characterize him as the American Wilkes, so John Wilkes of Britain, who famously wrote the 45th issue of the North Briton that criticized George III there. And people mobilized to him. They literally walked to his prison cell with 45 of whatever.
He's a giant celebrity across the colonies.
Yeah,
right?
he becomes
like
a martyr.
Yeah.
A martyr. And what eventually happens is the James Parker, who's a printer, he dies, and the case against MacDougall kind of collapses. But the case, sort of the attempted prosecution of MacDougall, mobilizes support to him, and people drift away from the Delanceys. So Sears, despite what he said earlier, he's out from the Delanceys. He goes right over to MacDougall. So is John Lamb, another prominent revolutionary who serves with distinction during the Revolutionary War. He was with the Delanceys up until this point. He shifts. John Holt, the printer, another one, he shifts. And at that point, MacDougall, Sears, and Lamb are kind of like a trio, and they mobilize a lot of support. And at that time, that's when the lines in the sand are almost drawn. That's when MacDougall and his supporters, they get Hampden Hall, this separate venue. The Delanceys have their own place where they go, and they kind of remain in these groups up until the revolution. They both agree that what Parliament is doing is bad, but they disagree on how to resolve the situation. And this really comes to a head in 74 and 75. The Delanceyites, the people who go on to become loyalists, want to use the assembly to show their opposition through traditional means like sending petitions, things like that.
As opposed to dumping tea in the harbor.
Yeah, it's kind of slow. MacDougall and his supporters, they don't want to go that way, partly because Colden is temporary governor again. He keeps sort of stalling, and the assembly doesn't meet, so it's not doing anything. So they want to form committees. So a bunch of committees are formed in New York in 74. They have varying numbers. so you have like the Committee of 50, Committee of 51, Committee of 60, Committee of 100. I don't know who thought of these names, but and they start out, they're almost mostly populated by people who are delancers, people who go on to become loyalists. But as the committees grow in number, the makeup changes, and the makeup becomes more people who go on to become patriots, people who are associated with MacDougall. And eventually, MacDougall has so much support that they almost completely usurp sort of the legislative government. And once you have the Continental Congress come in, MacDougall really sees an opportunity to forge intercolonial bonds and use that to mobilize further support. So when someone like John Adams comes down from Boston on his way to Philadelphia, MacDougall is pretty much at the outskirts of the city as like a welcome package. Welcome to New York. And Adams and the other delegates from Massachusetts spend longer there than anywhere else on their journey. And they spend almost the entire time with MacDougall and his associates. He essentially shows them around the city. Yeah. We were talking earlier about you could pretty much walk across it from one side to the other. MacDougall wants to be seen with Adams and Samuel Adams, who's there. They want to be associated with one another because these people have heard of John Adams, they've heard of Samuel Adams. And that's how MacDougall and his associates start to mobilize more support. And that's how people like Delancey, James Delancey and his supporters really start to lose a grip on sort of the popular means of mobilization because they just get overtaken by someone like MacDougall.
So we're at 7:34, and I think we should start the Q&A in a bit. But we're more or less there's more I wanted to talk to you about, but we're more or less kind of at time here. And Kevin, and I see your hand raised, and everyone else listening. The Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, if you would type in your questions there, and I'll take them in turn. So we're at the end of this period of the Imperial Crisis. These sort of tactics and sort of unforeseen circumstances kind of shift the alignments here, but there's not this kind of fundamental ideological rupture in the narrative that you're presenting, right? So so let's talk just, I think maybe sort of end the note on the question of like, well, where does this leave these folks if they're opposed to everything that the Crown and the Parliament have been doing, right? And they want to see a lot of the same things that the rebels want to see, if they are the rebels, as you're saying, and that's what they are. What's their sort of competing vision for how to? I mean, yes, they have these sort of tactical differences on, you know, but what is their? Is it just about tactics for you, or what would you say?
So the people who go on to become loyalists, they see what they interpret what's happening, like the creation of these committees and provincial congresses, as usurpation. Like the government is being usurped. These people are rebels, and they want the assembly to do something, and the assembly is kind of powerless at this time. So people like MacDougall and the revolutionaries come to them and say, "You're going to do this. You're going to sign the Continental Association. Many people do. You're going to give up your firearms. You're going to join us, because if you don't, things are going to be difficult." And it's really kind of mobilization by force. And many of them leave. Someone like Frederick Rhinelander, he leaves. He goes across the river into Jersey, and he settles for a time in a part in Bergen County, what's called the English neighborhood. And he settles there. And if you go onto something, Founders Online, where the papers of Washington, Jefferson, Adams are federated together, type in Rhinelander, he appears there, mentioned in a Washington document as a prominent loyalist. So they get out of New York City to go somewhere where they essentially feel safe. Because if the people who stayed, bad things could happen. And James Rivington's press gets destroyed by Isaac Sears. We've spoken about that elsewhere. And other people get physically attacked. And they have like, some of them just get like stones thrown at them. Some of them get properly harassed. And some people just fall in line. And they signed the Continental Association. They adhere to the patriot or the revolutionary narrative until the British come. And then their loyalism spouts out again, they take oaths of allegiance, they sign petitions. And the same thing kind of happens for those people who are revolutionaries or patriots. They're almost, some of them are forced to sign to take the oath. Some of them are forced to take the oath of allegiance. That happens on Long Island. I was corresponding with somebody today about it, and people were forced to do it because the British Army is on their doorstep. The Royal Governor, William Tryon, he's there, like physically there, with the largest professionally trained army in the world. You're going to do it.
Yeah.
And for many people to go back to when the Patriots were in control, they fell in line because of this sort of what they viewed as this sort of rogue group of people who were going to rough them up. If they didn't do it, something bad might happen to them, something bad might happen to their families. And so this rough mobilization happens a lot on both sides. It's not just one or the other.
Yeah. And it only gets worse during the war. All right, let's start taking some of these questions. So first one comes in from Hugh McGuire, who asks if you've read Ken Roberts' historical novel, Oliver Wiswell.
I don't think I have. I've definitely heard of it, but I don't think I've read it. I think I've looked at it, but not for a long time. But it sounds like something that I think I should read or revisit. So I'm going to make a note of it.
Okay, so that's the question is that historically accurate? So I can't answer that either. Gary Katz.
Follow up with me here.
Yes. It's too much to read. Gary Katz, throughout the conflict, there are consistently at least 3 different factions of support or loyalty or disloyalty. I think there's a question mark at the end of that. I don't know the 3 different factions, but I mean, it's sometimes been talked about as, like these terms get thrown around and it's really misleading, liberal and conservative and radical. What that means at the time and the way that people are using it or mean it, it's kind of confusing. But is that how you would group these folks in New York?
Yeah, like
McDougall and Sears representing the radicals, and Delancey the conservatives, and Livingston the centrists.
The way that I've framed it in here is that in the book is that I lent on research by a historian called Justin du Rivage, and he studied the political ideology of the British Empire, and he said that the empire was governed by competing ideologies, and he split them up into a number of groups. There are radical Whigs. That's where someone like McDougall falls. And so McDougall is aligned with someone like John Wilkes or William Pitt, the elder. Delancey's are more moderate. They're not authoritarian. The authoritarian Whigs are people like Francis Bernard in Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, Grenville. Delancey and they're all more moderate Whigs, establishment Whigs, and they're associated with people like the Marquis of Rockingham, famously known as the Friend of America, or someone like Edmund Burke, also known for his support of America. And the Delanceys have personal relationships with both of these people, and James Delancey has a wonderful correspondence with Rockingham. They primarily talk about horse racing, because that's what they both like, but they touch on politics a lot. And they're both instrumental in Edmund Burke's appointment as New York's agent in Parliament, and they have a correspondence with him as well. They share the same political views. So they're on a spectrum here. They're all Whigs. They just is where they fall on this kind of pendulum that's swinging. And McDougall, people like Samuel Adams, they're definitely radical. And then the Delanceys are not there. They're moderate or establishment Whigs. But I would really encourage everyone, if they haven't read it already, to look up Justin du Rivage, his book, because it's really fantastic. And it really helped me understand like the variations of Whiggism. Like now you have different level, like if you think about the parties in America today, there's variations within them. Like people are more to the left or people are more to the right in both parties. And du Rivage's work really helped me understand that within the context of the 18th century British Empire. And Steve Pincus's work has also been really helpful because he's focused on that as well.
Well, we've got a couple more questions here, but let me just dig a little deeper on that. So where do we then put the sort of Livingstons and the Delanceys? Are these just two different variants of that sort of moderate Whiggism?
I think so. I really do think so.
Yeah.
For someone like William Livingston, he's probably more toward the radical end, but he's prominent in New York City politics up until about the end of the 1760s, and then he essentially disappears from city politics because he moves to New Jersey, and he eventually becomes the first governor of Jersey. But he was probably more. If he'd stayed, would have been astounded if he didn't associate firmly with McDougall. I think he was just tired of it.
Well, it was an exhausting war. Lynn Hayden Finley asks, did your research identify any families that were divided over the war? And if that's the case, did you include their stories?
I didn't go too much into what happened to Loyalists during and after the war, but there are divisions within families, and there are extreme cases where families are split up after 1783. So when Loyalists leave, some go to Britain, some go to the Maritimes and Canada, and families are split up that way. And there is some quite sort of gut-wrenching correspondence about it, about how upset and emotional people are about leaving. An example from the book that I touch on is the Lowe family. So Isaac Lowe is a prominent member of the Delancey faction. He is a loyalist. He leaves. He goes to London. He eventually resettles there, and he has a really tough time adjusting to life there from New York City. Because he was a prominent guy in New York City, served in a number of the committees that I mentioned earlier. He leaves. His brother Nicholas stays, and they have a correspondence about Isaac's, I don't want to say complaining, but he's describing how difficult it is for him to adjust to life, and you feel for him.
Well, but just to add a little bit to that, like it's really just truly the wealthiest that sort of goes to the point you made at the start of the conversation. It's the some of the wealthiest or most sort of radical or prominent that sort of leave. There's about 60,000 people who loyalists who leave at the end of the war, which is a huge number. It's bigger than the exodus we see from, say, the French Revolution. But there's a huge number that stay, as many as about 450,000 is the high estimate.
Vast majority.
Roughly a sixth of the country, to put that into better terms, right? When the Loyalists represent roughly a fifth of the country by common estimates at the start, right?
And some of the more prominent Loyalists, they go to Britain and they settle in and around London. The lesser Loyalists who weren't as prominent, they go to Canada. They go to places like New Brunswick because they're given land, and it's for them. I haven't studied this fully, but I would really like to do a comparative analysis of the people who stayed versus the people who left. But the people who went to New Brunswick, they saw an opportunity there to set up a new life. It could have been a better life. For example, there was one person who was a tenant on Phillips Manor. He left, set up a new life in New Brunswick. For some of the prominent people in New York that I write about, Frederick Rhinelander, they stay. Despite being mentioned in the Washington papers as a notorious loyalist, he stays, and he establishes himself as one of the most prominent people in New York City. And by the early 1800s, when he dies, the obituaries or death notices, they don't mention that he signed pretty much every loyalist document around. He was associating with the Astor family, and that part of his life was forgotten.
We have the Seaburys and English story, right? Like the Anglican ministers are some of the most feared opponents and hated opponents for the rebels by the end of the crisis. Charles Inglis is the Reverend Minister at Trinity Church in New York. He has to leave. There's an attainder that calls for his execution, like Delancey and some of these other people. But then Seabury, who's a prominent minister in Connecticut, ends up becoming so Inglis goes off to Canada, to New Brunswick, and becomes, very prominent figure up there. Seabury, who's just as hated, ironically becomes the first bishop of the American Episcopal Church, right? The Anglican Church in the US, right?
Yeah, and I found a wonderful collection in Scotland that is correspondence between the Anglican ministers, and they talk about how this is an unnatural war, and you can really you get a sense of who these people are. And I really like Charles Inglis. His letters were brilliant, and Seabury's letters were brilliant as well. And
they're feared for a reason.
Seabury was imprisoned for a while because of his loyalism, his loyalty, and he's writing to another loyalist in Britain, and it's quite vivid the way that they write. And he said that he has to step away from the page that he's writing because he's crying so much because he misses his friend. And you can't see any tears on the manuscript, but that's what he was worried about. And their paths after the revolution are really interesting, especially Seabury. He was in prison for a long time. He was engaged in that pamphlet war with Hamilton in 74. Later, he features prominently in the musical. Well, not prominently, but he's there in the musical, The Only Loyalist. And he goes on to become the bishop that everyone feared.
So Keith Brooks has a question. Something we haven't talked about becomes a very big issue in the war, and I wonder what you think about it for the period you're talking about. This is the question of Black Americans, most of whom are enslaved at this point, but who flock. And this is maybe still one of the lesser known things about the revolution, but it's sometimes called the first emancipation because there's a huge upset in the number of slaves that existed in the North. The institution itself is sort of destabilized. That sort of sets up the Mason-Dixon line, the early stages of the Civil War. It also sees huge numbers gaining their freedom, and many of them by joining the British and the Loyalists in the war, and nowhere more than in New York, where 10,000 of the estimated 20,000 end up settling in the wider metro area. So Keith asks, what about those folks? And I think the implication of this question is, how do they figure into the story you're telling?
Yeah, this is a great point. And to go back to where I started, is that I started with these lists of people. And in going through these lists, like studying historical documents, it's very difficult to identify somebody's race. And in some documents, it is mentioned, like muster rolls, for example. Sometimes you'll see if someone was Black. And in the petitions that I looked at, it was almost impossible. But in the oath of allegiance that was tendered in Manhattan, in New York City, there was a list of 5 people five free Black people who took the oath of allegiance. And from the people I identified, they were the only ones that I was confident that they were Black. The other people I was not. And I've tried to identify people doing other types of research, but it's very difficult. And so in terms of this story, and sort of in this book, enslaved and free Black people don't feature much. And that's because I spoke about how it's hard to piece together people's stories in an urban center like New York. It's even harder for the enslaved and free Black people. The sources that are available are fewer in number, and it's very difficult to track their sort of political action or anything that they did prior to the Imperial Crisis. Sometimes because they weren't allowed to go into taverns or public spaces like coffee houses. They weren't in those spaces, so you have to explore their stories using other ways. And I think in the terms of the history of New York City and in the coming of the revolution, that is a big gap in the research. And it's something that I hoped to fill, but I wasn't able to because I wasn't able to find the right sources. But in my my day job, I've been working on the papers of George Washington, and we're working on Yorktown right now, the siege and surrender of Yorktown, and Black people, enslaved and free, going to British lines is a constant. It appears in the volume, and Washington wants to capture these people and capture the enslaved people and return them to their owners, and he's quite explicit about that. And they allege that Cornwallis is trying to mobilize as many as possible to try and to turn the tide a little bit. But I really do think that the Imperial Crisis before the Revolution, there is a large gap in the literature, and I would love to be able to study it in the future. But it's a really great question, and I hope that more work.
Well, I want to end this conversation by asking you about what you come away with from this project specifically as like the new area, like for the frontiers for research, and like where we, what are the big questions that this raises that are new? What are the big questions that are still unanswered? How does this sort of shift But before you start formulating your answers to that, let me just throw in another thing that doesn't come up too much in the book, but I think, for probably similar reasons to what you just gave. Kevin Murphy asks about the 68 elections often associated with the Hudson Valley land riots. Was there any connection there for the development of loyalist solidarity?
Not that I found. Not that I found it. I did look into this because I wanted to find something. I wanted to find a connection with the people who were involved, especially on the legal side of things, but I wasn't able to. And that was a good case of letting the sources dictate how I was going forward. I could have tried to like shoehorn that in, but I don't think it would have made a substantial contribution to the argument that I was making. But it is very fascinating.
And is that, yeah, I agree. But it's a source problem again.
I think so.
As with before, yeah.
Because my work was so focused on Manhattan, and it's really small pockets of Manhattan. Yeah. What was happening in Hudson Valley for many people was something they read about in the newspaper.
But there is connection, right? I mean, so we see some of the big riots around the Stamp Act and other things, farmers coming down, supposedly, according to some of the people reporting at the time from surrounding areas. I don't know that I doubt that they're sort of maybe coming as far down.
Yeah, I wasn't able to
valley, but yeah,
to make like a positive connection between the groups that I was studying that would further what I was trying to say. I think it might have just been a distraction, or it would have been one of those things that when the manuscript goes out to your referees or your reviewers, they'll be like, you should explore this further, or just pull it. And it pulled it.
All right, so we got about 5-6 minutes here. I think it makes sense to end with the question I laid out at the before. I mean, from conversations we've had, I think this is the point of studying New York. This is why loyalists are so important. I think the sort of the big question is, it sort of turns the whole sort of narrative quite upside down to not think of loyalists as these reactionaries who only represent sort of the wealthiest sort of cronies of England, the imperial structure, but instead to be a bunch of young farmers, many of them sort of lower middle class or sort of or lower still, and quite a diverse group, ethnically, religiously. By the time of the war, for sure, including many African Americans, the majority. So what does that do to our sort of understanding of the revolution, and where do you think the new areas of research, what should be, what did you, in terms of sources or in terms of just big interpretive questions that we're not asking but should be?
This is a book about people who became loyalists. That's the primary focus of the book. But when you read sort of a little deeper through it, and you engage with what MacDougall and his actions and his actions compared to the Delancey's, it's a story about the coming of the revolution and how people eventually sort of staked their claim to one side or the other. And as much as it is a story about the origins of loyalism, I think it's just as much a story about the origins and the coming of the revolution.
I agree.
And that approach, reorienting how we think about the coming of the revolution, is one that I would like to see in other places across the colonies. What happened in Philadelphia? Because a lot of the work sort of in the last 20, 30 years is focused on the early republic and the centrality of Philadelphia to that. And New York has often been left behind. But in like examining what happens in Philadelphia or Newport or Boston or somewhere like Williamsburg in Virginia, like who were the loyalists there? Did they sign similar documents when the time came in 75, 76? How did they get to that point? Because that's what I wanted to explore. How did they get to this point where they had to sign something? What led them there? Did they come in groups? Birds of a feather fly together? Was it something like that? Were they forced to sign it? And if they were forced, what does that mean? And so really is examining the nature of allegiance, identity building, the importance of relationships, people's everyday lives. And that's where I see sort of a gap in the research, is studying the sort of the impact of everyday interactions on people's political behavior. Bumping into someone on the street, going into their store a lot, how did that impact sort of everyday politics? Like if you live somewhere like New York City today, you become friendly with the person at the local bagel store or in the local bodega. Like the person in my bagel store, I was friends with them. And when I went back in after a little while, they're like, oh, you're back. Yeah. You develop these type of relationships. And when you're put in a situation where you're forced to make a decision, whether you sign a document or you don't, quite often I think you'll speak to your friends about what you're going to do, people you know. And
Well,
that's shaped my research.
I mean, especially at a time when we're talking about politics and elections and things like that, this is not what people sort of assume now in the age of the secret ballot, and like people, this is a very public thing, right? You make this point several times in the book. You sign your name to those petitions. Other people see that. That's maybe part of the reason why you're signing, because you see your friends' names on it, or other people who might have some power over you, or it's a very public. The entire thing is quite sort of out in the open.
Yeah, and especially like one of the Loyalist declarations is at the New York Historical Society now. Charles Ingalls wrote it. That was left in a tavern for 3 days. Like you can imagine going into a pub now and seeing a document like that. You're going to see people sign it, and people signed in their like friendship groups. The same people who I know associated with each other a lot, whether it was through business or family, they signed one after the other, and you can know it's a different signature each time. So you can see them passing the pen. There you go, and you can sign it like that. And that's what's really interesting about those types of documents, is that you can see sort of the individual impact, but also the group impact, because you have these groups signing together.
The book is Unfriendly to Liberty, and the author is Christopher Minty, and the publisher is Cornell University Press. And I hope that you all go out and buy a copy. We are sorry again for some of the technical difficulty at the beginning. We will find out whoever is responsible, and we will tar and feather them and hang them from the nearest tree. I hope to see you all in a couple of weeks. We'll be talking about Times Square and 125 years of change. Chris, I will talk to you soon, I'm sure. Thanks again. Congratulations. It's a great book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming.
Okay. Have a good night.
Thanks.